Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something, I think, pretty interesting, agroecology.
Yeah.
And we're using this handbook called Introduction to Agroecology. So we'll be drawing a lot from that.
Okay.
And basically, we're trying to go beyond just the buzzwords, right?
Mhm.
When you hear agroecology, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
What are the principles behind it?
Exactly. Agroecology is really about taking a systems approach to agriculture
Okay.
and, kind of moving away from this reductionist mindset and really looking at the interconnectedness of the different components of the food system.
Yeah.
So it's not just about growing food, but also considering the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of agriculture.
Okay. So it's not just about, using less pesticides or something like that.
Right.
It's about
Yeah, it's a much broader concept.
Yeah,
It's really about reshaping our relationship with nature and with each other.
Right. Okay. So I'm seeing in the handbook they mentioned these three kind of core ecological principles:
Right.
biodiversity, ecosystem services, and natural resource management.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing those are all kind of intertwined with each other.
Yeah, they're completely intertwined. I mean, you can't really talk about one without the others.
Okay.
Biodiversity is really the foundation of a healthy agro-ecosystem.
Okay.
And then, the more biodiversity you have in your system, the more ecosystem services you're going to get. And then managing those natural resources in a way that supports biodiversity is what makes the whole thing work.
So could you explain a little more about why biodiversity is so important? I mean, some people might think, well, why does it matter if we have 50 different kinds of plants instead of just a field of corn?
Yeah. Well, monocultures, which is what you're describing, those big fields of corn, they're really vulnerable, to pests, to diseases, to extreme weather events. And we're seeing more and more of those extreme weather events with climate change. So having a diversity of plants on your farm is like having an insurance policy. If one crop fails, you've got others to fall back on.
Right. It's like not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
So that makes sense. But how does that actually translate into benefits for the farmer? What are those ecosystem services that you were talking about?
Yeah. So ecosystem services are all those things that nature does for us for free.
Mm-hmm.
Things like pollination, pest control, soil fertility, water purification, climate regulation.
Wow.
All these things are essential for agriculture, but we often take them for granted.
Uh-huh.
And when we destroy biodiversity, we're actually undermining those services, and then we end up having to pay for them, through things like synthetic fertilizers and pesticides.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's we're not even paying attention to these free services that nature's giving us.
Exactly.
And then we're having to pay for them.
Exactly.
When we could just be working with nature. Okay. So if these services aren't actually free, what does it mean to manage natural resources effectively?
Yeah, well, it's really about treating our natural resources as the precious assets that they are. Soil, water, air, genetic diversity, these are the building blocks of life.
Yeah.
And we need to manage them in a way that ensures their long-term health and productivity.
So it's we've been treating soil like dirt.
Yeah.
Instead of a living ecosystem.
Exactly.
And that's what agroecology is trying to shift.
Right. It's about recognizing that we're part of nature, not separate from it.
Okay. But even if we're producing food in the most ecologically sound way possible, what about the people involved?
Right.
Agroecology also talks about fairness and accessibility.
Absolutely.
How do those principles translate to the farm level?
Yeah, well, fairness means ensuring that everyone involved in the food system has a fair share of the benefits.
Okay.
So that means secure land rights for small-scale farmers, fair prices for their products, and access to the resources they need to succeed.
Okay, so it's not just about corporate farms getting all the profits and the small farmers are left behind.
Exactly.
It's about making sure everybody's got a seat at the table.
Right, and that the benefits are distributed equitably.
Yeah, and what about accessibility? I mean, how do we make sure that everyone has access to healthy food, especially in low-income communities or food deserts?
Yeah, accessibility means ensuring that everyone has access to healthy, culturally appropriate food, regardless of their income or where they live.
Okay.
So that means supporting things like farmers markets, community gardens, food co-ops,
Yeah.
Initiatives that bring fresh food into communities that might not have access to it.
It's bridging that gap between producers and consumers,
Exactly.
especially in those areas where it's harder to find.
Right.
Okay. The handbook also mentions community engagement as a key principle of agroecology.
Yeah.
So it seems like this is as much about social connections as it is about ecological ones.
Absolutely.
So, like, what does that look like in practice?
Well, it's about things like farmer field schools, seed-saving networks, places where farmers can come together and share their knowledge and experiences.
Wow.
It's about tapping into that collective wisdom that's been passed down through generations.
Right, and also, like, adapting it to, like, modern challenges and stuff.
Exactly.
Okay. I guess one question that might come up is, like, isn't there a risk of romanticizing small-scale farming?
Yeah.
Like, can agroecology really feed the world, or is it just kind of a niche movement?
Right. That's a really important question. And, that's where we get into this debate between weak and strong ecological modernization.
Okay.
Weak ecological modernization is kind of like trying to make the current industrial agriculture system a little bit less bad.
Okay.
So you might use technologies like precision farming to reduce pesticide use, or maybe, do some cover cropping to improve soil health.
So it's like trying to make the existing system more efficient.
Yeah, but it doesn't really challenge the fundamental structure of the system.
Okay.
It's still based on monocultures and heavy reliance on external inputs.
So it's like putting a Band-Aid on like a bigger problem.
Right.
Okay, and what about strong ecological modernization?
Yeah, well, strong ecological modernization is more about a radical transformation of the food system.
Okay.
It's about moving away from those monocultures and really embracing diversity. Agroforestry, permaculture, integrated pest management, these are all examples of agroecological practices that fall under that strong category.
So it's about working with nature's complexity instead of trying to simplify it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these two different paths,
Yeah.
Tweaking the system we have versus like a more fundamental overhaul.
Right.
I'm sensing like there's a lot of debate and nuance here.
Yeah, definitely.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think it would be helpful to look at some real world examples of how these two approaches are playing out on farms around the world.
Okay.
What are the challenges and opportunities associated with each approach?
Yeah, that sounds good.
And, ultimately, what are the trade-offs that we need to consider as we transition towards a more agroecological future?
Awesome. Well, let's dive into those examples in the next part then.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive on agroecology.
Picking up where we left off with this idea of weak versus strong ecological modernization.
Right. Two very different approaches.
Yeah. And it feels like, a lot of gray area in between as well.
Definitely, it's not black and white.
Right. So maybe we can make it a little more concrete with some examples. Like, what would a weak approach look like in the real world?
Okay, so imagine a large industrial farm, say in the Midwest, growing mostly corn.
Oh.
Now, the farmer's concerned about the environmental impact.
Okay.
So they decide to adopt some new technology, like precision farming.
Okay.
Using sensors, GPS-guided machinery, that kind of stuff.
So trying to be more efficient with their resources.
Exactly, less waste.
Maybe using less fertilizer and pesticide.
Right, the goal is to reduce the negative impacts.
Okay, so that sounds like a good thing, right?
It is. Less pollution, healthier soil, that's all positive.
But
the underlying structure of the farm hasn't changed.
Right.
They're still growing a monoculture of corn.
Okay.
Still relying on external inputs like fertilizers, even if it's less.
So it's like making the existing system a bit better.
Yeah, less harmful, but not fundamentally different.
Right. I see. So that's the weak approach.
Exactly. Kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a bigger problem.
Okay, so what would a strong example look like? Something really different.
Okay, let's go to a small farm in India, maybe.
Okay.
Family farm passed down through generations, and here they're growing a huge variety of crops.
Oh, wow.
Fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, all mixed together.
Like a really diverse system.
Exactly. And this farmer relies on traditional knowledge to manage pests and diseases.
So no pesticides. Wouldn't that be a nightmare?
Not necessarily. They understand the ecosystem.
Okay.
They plant things that attract beneficial insects, the good bugs that eat the bad bugs.
Oh.
They use intercropping, planting different species together to confuse pests.
So it's like they're working with nature instead of fighting it.
Exactly. And their soil is incredibly healthy.
I bet, with all those different plants.
They compost, they use cover crops, they see the soil as alive.
Right, not just dirt.
Exactly. A completely different mindset.
Wow. It's amazing how these two examples are so different.
Right. One is about tweaking the existing system. The other is about creating something completely new.
So which approach is better?
Well, it depends.
I figured you'd say that.
There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Okay.
Weak ecological modernization can be a good first step.
Okay.
especially for large-scale farms that are heavily invested in the industrial model.
Right.
It can help reduce harm while they transition to more holistic practices.
Okay. But ultimately, we want to move towards stronger forms of agroecology.
Ideally, yes, towards systems that are truly in harmony with nature.
Right, that are resilient and beneficial for everyone.
Exactly. Agroecology is not just about making the old system a bit less bad. It's about creating something truly new, something that nourishes both people and the planet.
I like that. So where do we as individuals fit into all of this? Like, does it really matter what kind of tomato I buy at the store? It can feel kind of overwhelming, right? Like all these big problems in the food system.
Yeah, it's easy to feel powerless.
But we've been talking about how agroecology really starts at like the ground level.
It does.
With individuals making different choices.
Absolutely. I mean, it's about those everyday decisions that we make.
Yeah.
What we buy, where we buy it, how much we waste.
So we're not just like passive consumers.
No, not at all. We have a lot of power.
Okay, so like where do we start? I mean, there's so much information out there. It's hard to know what to trust.
We'll start by asking questions.
Okay.
You know, when you're at the store, look at the labels. Where was this food grown? How was it grown?
Okay.
And then try to connect with your local farmers. Go to farmers markets. Join a CSA.
Okay.
You know, really get to know where your food is coming from.
Yeah, and like look for certifications like organic or fair trade.
Exactly. Those are good indicators that the farmers are committed to sustainability and social justice.
So it's about like going beyond just the price tag.
It is. It's about understanding the true cost of our food choices.
Right. And like what about food waste? Well, that seems like a huge problem too.
Oh, it's a massive problem. You know, something like a third of all the food that we produce ends up in landfills.
Wow.
And that's just a huge waste of resources.
And it contributes to climate change too, right?
Absolutely. So, you know, we can all do our part by planning our meals, storing our food properly, and getting creative with leftovers.
That's going back to those like old school values, right?
Exactly, like respecting food.
Okay, so we can make changes in our own lives, but how do we like amplify our impact?
Well, get involved in your community.
Okay.
Support organizations that are working on food justice issues. Volunteer at a community garden.
Okay.
Contact your elected officials and let them know that you care about these issues.
So it's about like using our voices and our actions to create a food system that's better for everyone.
Right.
I feel like it's a journey, not a destination.
It is. It's an ongoing process of learning and adapting and working together.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive on agroecology.
I have.
And I hope it's given our listeners some food for thought. No pun intended.
I hope so too.
We've explored the principles, the challenges, and the opportunities. And I think the main takeaway is that we all have a role to play in creating a more sustainable and just food future.
Absolutely.
So what small step can you take today? Maybe it's trying a new recipe with local ingredients or composting your food scraps.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just starting a conversation with your friends and family about agroecology.
Any action, no matter how small, can make a difference.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. And remember, the future of food is in our hands.
Thanks for having me.